Hey Chris, tell us how your passion for RPGs was born and how you went from player to author.
It's really difficult for me to explain why I like RPGs so much because they are so very much my thing that I struggle to elucidate why. I got started on them. Three things happened more or less the same time. I got started reading fighting fantasy game books when I was a kid, and I think it was 1989-ish. Dungeoneer was released, which was the fighting fantasy game book role-playing game. And I got into that with my friends. And at the same time ish, Games Workshop teamed up with Milton Bradley to release the Hero Quest board game, which I loved, and I played that with my friends too. And that got us into Games Workshop. And through that, I got into Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay because I hate painting miniatures. So the idea that I could play a game set in the Warhammer world without having to paint a single thing was very good, very appealing to young me. And the third thing that was happening kind of continuously throughout this period was that my dad is very into model aeroplanes, and he would go to the model aeroplane shop, and I'd go along with him. And he would chat to the model aeroplane guy behind the counter about model aeroplane things, and I would read their role playing game section, whichever bits of it I could reach, because I was, still a kid. And that got me into GURPS and Shadowrun and Werewolf, which was probably too low down for someone as young as I was to really get his hands on, but I got it anyway. And all of these things happened, and I just kind of fell into role playing as a thing I really enjoyed doing. I didn't really get into D&D until much later, mid 90s ish. And again, I couldn't. Sorry, the cat's misbehaving on the other side of the room. I couldn't tell you exactly when I went from being a player to a author as well. I've done freelance work here and there since the mid 2000s, and just around late 2014, I had a bunch of notes written up from a campaign I'd run in fourth edition D&D, and I thought I could turn this into money. So I made it into Plague of Storms, named my company Certain Death because I believed it was going to fail immediately and cost me all the money I'd invested. And it didn't. Plague of Storms sold slowly but continuously, and that was the start. I mean, I also had it was released just after the birth of my daughter, so I had plenty of other stuff going on, so it didn't matter that it was selling slowly. And then a couple of years later, I wrote Pigsmoke and kickstarted that because Kickstarter was sort of just taking off around the time, or it had just taken off. And once I made a pile of money on Pigsmoke, which is more money than I'd made on anything previous. That was it. That was I can. That was where I realized I can make it work as a business.
Some of your games have very clear reference works. Pigsmoke immediately makes you think of Harry Potter, as well as Bleak Spirit appears as a splendid tribute to soulslike games. Me Too, when I created Shakedown City, now on Kickstarter, had Tarantino's cinema and comics like Sin City in mind. How important is it to have strong references to define the atmosphere of a game?
I don't think strong references are important so much as a clear idea of what you are trying to do. And a strong reference helps with that. Like for Bleak Spirit, I was very specifically trying to capture the experience I had playing Dark Souls 3. And because I had that clear idea in mind and that very obvious reference point that not only could I go back to, but I could point other people towards, what happened, it helps keep your vision clear as you're writing, because you can always go back to this idea that what am I trying to do? What am I getting at with this creation? And I think, yeah, video games and comics and other media are a really useful touchstone for that. They make it easier to have that, what's the phrase, that strong reference, strong idea of what you're doing, but it's not necessary. I mean, I'd point to Dungeons and Dragons as an example, in that D&D at this point is really just reinventing itself with each new edition, and the only strong reference it really has is the previous edition of D&D and the various cultural baggage attached to that.
You are a versatile author. You go from very dark games to goofy comedy. You've also designed solo RPGs. What will the next frontier be?
I am working on two things, which are likely to be the next thing. Three things. I've got some freelance work I'm doing, which I should be doing right now. That's probably going to be the next thing. But in terms of the stuff that I'm doing for myself, there's Crossover, which is an attempt to do a sort of crossover fan fiction game where you just have it needs to be loose enough to kind of model characters from pretty much any work of fiction or original characters if you like, and the worlds they live in, and you mash them all together and have adventures. The mechanics for that are pretty much done. I just need to test it and then do a whole load of adventure writing. The other thing I'm working on and have been for some time would be Mage Knight Academy, returning to the magical school well, except this time you're students at the magical school and you have magic powers and you have sword fights. And this is my attempt at doing a crunchy tactical game. And it's the mechanics are pretty much done, but testing crunchy games is really hard because you have to really grind the numbers. You have to really try and redline everything, see where the exploits are, see what the it's tricky. I find testing very difficult, which is why I got into designing solo RPGs to start with, because the testing was way easier than putting groups together to test other games. But yeah, it's probably going to be Crossover or Mage Knight Academy. If I can find a decent future for crowdfunding, because that's a whole other thing. I don't know how I'm going to fund games that size without crowdfunding, but that's a problem for future me. Right now, I have to actually finish the game.
I was very intrigued by Milkshake, which you define as a game about weird experiences at a McDonald's drive thru in the middle of the night. Where did the idea come from?
Twitter thread. Somebody wrote a Twitter thread describing an experience they had at the McDonald's drive-through in the middle of the night, and I thought it just struck something in me, so I threw together this game, which creates similar sorts of narratives. Well, I actually thought it was unplayable. I thought it was an extended shitpost, which is why I don't charge any money for it. But I have seen people play it on stream and do a fine job. So congratulations, Beholder's Eye. You have played a game which I didn't really think anyone could ever actually play. Should I admit that? I don't know. Anyway, yeah, it was just inspired by this Twitter thread about somebody who had a weird experience at McDonald's in the middle of the night, and I thought, that sounds like something I could create with a series of random tables. So I did. It took about 2 hours to write, longer than that to lay out, and I just threw it up for nothing because, as I said, I didn't really think it was playable.
Which authors influenced you the most?
Um, I don't read a huge amount these days. I used to read a lot. Uh, I used to have a Saturday job in a library when I was 17, and every Saturday I would leave with a literal bin bag full of books over my shoulder, polish them off during the week, go back the next weekend, do the same thing. These days, I think I would say Robert Howard is one of them because I really like the original Conan stories. I think a lot of the Inheritor stories are bad and boring. Um, yeah, they're pretty dull. But the original Robert Howard Conan stories are extremely good if you can get past the flagrant racism, sexism, weird ideas about manifest destiny and that kind of thing. Like, I'm not about to say they don't have problems, but if you are able to get past them, well worth a read. My favorite would be The Scarlet Citadel, featuring the sorcerer Pelias, who is a fantastic character who gets very little screen time, page time, but who, even in that small appearance, manages to establish a really strong character voice and attitude, and also kind of show off why Conan the Barbarian is scared of sorcerers in a way that I think some of the other stories don't quite manage. Because in the other stories, you're told, oh, this person's a powerful sorcerer, and then Conan just skewers him with a sword, and that's the end of that. But because of the situation that Conan encounters Pelias in, you actually get to see him do his stuff, which I think is it's pretty neat. More recently, I think Jenna Moran springs to mind, also a role-playing game designer. Jubo's Marvelous Wish Granting Engine, Nobilis, some other bits and pieces. Weapons of the Gods, was it? Precursor to Legends of the Wulin. I think it was called Weapons of the Gods. But yeah, she used to do a fiction blog called Hither Be Dragons, which I would read and enjoy immensely, despite not really understanding a lot of the deeper references that were going on. She's written a bunch of novellas. Unclean Legacy is very, very good. I recommend it to everyone. Um, Emily Short, who is an interactive fiction designer. And interactive fiction, they're kind of blending games and writing. But Emily Short can do both. She's very good at both things. I would recommend any game she's made. They're usually pretty short. Counterfeit Monkey is my favorite. But again, pretty much anything, especially if you look into what's going on under the hood while you're having your fun conversations and whatnot.